Flight attendant sees husband on plane, but then notices strange detail. You won't believe this flight attendant's heartbreaking discovery about her husband on a routine flight. Lena gasped, her heart seizing in her chest. It couldn't be real. No, 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 she found herself murmuring. This can't be true. Yet, she couldn't tear her gaze away from the end of the airplane aisle. She stared at him again. Those warm brown eyes looked identical to his. But how was this possible? No, it couldn't be. She looked again, and again. No way. She wanted to scream, but her lungs refused to cooperate. Her whole body felt numb and frozen. All she could do was stare in disbelief. She studied his familiar brown eyes, the shape of his face, his rough hands that she knew so well, hands that had held hers tenderly. This was impossible. She kept staring at the man for almost 10 minutes, but he didn't seem to notice. He was busy unpacking his bag and preparing for the flight. Meanwhile, Lena's world had turned upside down. This had to be her husband. Her mind spun. This had to be her husband. But how could it be him? And if it was him, why was he sitting here on this plane, unaware of her standing nearby? She was sure she was looking at him, yet she was equally sure that he couldn't be here. Her mind began to wander. Could he have tricked everyone, even her? This chilling thought sent her reality spiraling into chaos. Just minutes earlier, her mood had been so different. She had mentally prepared herself for the upcoming flight. It was her first month back at work after that horrible day, and though it was busy, it provided a much-needed distraction. Her job as a flight attendant, and the interactions it brought, helped her feel better after the tough time she had been through since the previous year. Before boarding the plane, she took a deep breath and forced a fake smile. She had told herself that if she kept pretending to be happy, eventually her body would believe it too. So she briskly stowed away luggage and inspected overhead compartments, comfortably slipping into her familiar routine. Her colleagues chatted animatedly around her, eagerly discussing their weekend plans post-landing. She attempted to soak in their enthusiasm, hoping it would quell the uneasy feeling rumbling in her stomach. This flight signified not merely her return to work, but her re-entry into life. She needed to believe she was prepared, that the shadow of the previous year had faded enough to allow her to function again. But then, just as the plane was preparing for boarding, she spotted him. It was as though her heart had abruptly ceased to beat. Her body became a statue and a deafening silence enveloped her world. What on earth? Lena's heart hammered wildly in her chest as she gaped at the man seated at the end of the aisle. Her body froze, and all she could do was stare at the man in seat 37A. What on earth was he doing there? This couldn't be possible. Her heart raced, and she stammered, "This can't be happening, this can't be true." Suddenly, she was completely lost in the moment, forgetting everything around her. Her coworkers, the other passengers, and the preparations for boarding all faded from her mind. She could only stare at him. He had the same warm hazel eyes, the same chestnut hair, and even his mannerisms were identical. Her pulse quickened as she continued to stare. But it couldn't be real, right? This had to be some kind of cruel illusion. She stared at him again, still unable to believe it. What was happening? Was this some kind of sick prank? Every detail of his face mirrored that of his. But it couldn't be him. She knew it was impossible. Yet, there he was, sitting a couple of rows away from her. She continued to stare at him, but he didn't seem to notice her presence. Her mind was in turmoil, struggling to comprehend how Gabriel could be on this flight. The same warm brown eyes that once gazed at her with love and devotion now looked out the window without recognition. The strong, tender hands that had caressed her skin were now calmly flipping through an airplane magazine. She needed to be certain. She had to know for sure. Gathering her courage, she decided to confront him. Lena quickly grabbed the coffee cart and poured a cup of fresh, steaming coffee. Then, she took a deep breath, her heart pounding, threatening to burst from her chest. She had to know. With unsteady legs, she stood abruptly and marched towards the back of the plane. The closer she got, the better she could see him. But the impossibility of the situation made her unable to believe her eyes. "I apologize for the delay, sir," she began speaking, but her words froze in her throat. He looked up, and their eyes met. The cup slipped from her grasp, splashing coffee everywhere as it dropped to the floor. Her dress was completely ruined, but she didn't even notice. All she could do was stare at him. Lena's mind reeled, unable to comprehend how Gabriel could be on this flight, alive and well. She had been there when his coffin was lowered into the earth. She had mourned his death every day since, falling into an absolute mess. For months, she couldn't sleep, eat, or even shower properly. Yet here he sat, not even an arm's length away. The resemblance was uncanny, from the hints of gray at his temples to the fine creases branching from the corners of his eyes when he smiled. Every rational instinct told Lena that this man could not possibly be Gabriel. But her pounding heart drowned out reason, fixated on the living ghost before her. She studied every inch of his face, searching for even the slightest difference, some imperfection in this phantom of her husband. However, her thoughts were interrupted by a loud scream that jolted her out of her paralyzed state. The man, her Gabriel, started screaming at her. Lena blinked in confusion. What? Was this the way he greeted her? What was going on? Lena stood rooted to the floor. This couldn't be true. It must be a dream. But he kept screaming. Can't you see that there's someone seated here? He continued. He looked really angry. But how could that be possible? He shouldn't be angry at her. He had never raised his voice like this at her before. Why was he acting like he didn't know her? Lena's eyes started to water as she stared at him, frozen in her place. Suddenly, she felt a firm hand on her shoulder. It was her fellow attendant, Cassandra. Please accept my apologies on behalf of my colleague, she said. I'll clean this up right away. She smiled at the man and gave Lena a stern look. Finally snapping out of her frozen state, Lena became aware of her surroundings, the people staring at her colleague Cassandra looking slightly angry, and the spilled coffee everywhere. She felt embarrassed, confused, and hurt, a whirlwind of emotions crashing over her. All she knew was that she needed to get out of there. So she quickly squeezed herself down the aisle and, without saying anything, hurried back to the galley. There, she could finally breathe again. It didn't take long before the quietness of her mind got interrupted by the loud yelling of her colleague, Cassandra. What was that? She glared angrily at Lena. This is why I warned you not to come back to work so soon, Lena. You need rest, you're not ready to work. Lena's mind was racing. Her colleague had already warned her about not being ready to work again after Gabriel's death. She had been stubborn, insisting that she was fine and ready to return to work. But now, she had seen her late husband, or at least someone who looked exactly like him. She was so convinced, but what if it was all a lie? What if it wasn't true? Doubt and confusion clouded her mind, leaving her heart in turmoil. Lena had lost her husband, Gabriel, to a heart attack almost 6 months ago. He had been the love of her life since high school, and they had always been each other's firsts. Gabriel was the first to break her heart, but he was also the first to pick it back up again. After a while, they decided to take their relationship to another level and promised to be with each other forever. One day, I will marry you, Lena Marie Clarkson, he had said, lovingly stroking a strand of her hair behind her ear at the high school dance. Got married. And he did. 8 years later, they got married, vowing to be there for each other until death do them part. Never in a million years would Lena have expected death to arrive so quickly. After just 10 years of marriage, Gabriel unexpectedly suffered a heart attack and passed away. It all happened so quickly that sometimes it still felt like a dream to Lena. One day, she was happily married, and the next, she was all alone, grieving the death of her husband. Lena was plunged into despair after his death. She found herself alone and without children. Refusing to accept her new reality, she practically isolated herself from the rest of the world. But as time passed, she realized she couldn't continue like this. One day, when she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the person staring back. The loss had taken its toll, turning her from a cheerful young woman into a frail, older-looking version of herself, deprived of care and love. At that point, she made the decision to return to her job and start anew. However, she had never expected that exactly 6 months after saying goodbye to her husband, this would happen. She still couldn't believe it. It brought back painful memories of losing her beloved better half, Gabriel. Oh, can't you hear me? Cassandra grabbed Lena's shoulders and shook her, trying to bring her back to the present and interrupt her thoughts. Lena was confused and looked at Cassandra's serious face. What? She asked. He wants to talk to you, Cassandra repeated firmly. Who wants to talk to me? Lena asked, bewildered. And then, before she even pointed her finger, Lena already knew. It was him. He wanted to talk. Lena didn't understand what was going on, but she decided to go for it. She wanted answers more than anything, and maybe now she would get them. So, she took a deep breath and steadied herself before approaching him. Hello, Gabriel, she began, but then stumbled. Sir, I'm sorry. He looked at her, and she continued to speak, rattling off her words. I'm sorry about the coffee. I was just so surprised to see you. He looked at her with a confused expression, and it dawned on Lena that he didn't recognize her. Anyways, he started, I wanted to make sure you're okay. He offered her an apologetic smile. I was a bit harsh on you earlier and could sense that you were tense. Is everything alright? He asking. Lena was flabbergasted. How could he possibly say that? Didn't he know who she was? Or didn't he? She felt utterly confused. From the look on his face, it was clear that he didn't know who she was and was just being polite. Was he losing his mind? Or perhaps she was the one losing her mind, and this was a complete stranger who had nothing to do with her late husband. Maybe her mind was playing tricks on her. Lena knew she needed to find out the truth. She needed to get away from this conversation as quickly as possible. "Thank you for your concern, sir," she replied, forcing a polite smile. "I'm all good. Is there anything else I can do for you?" "Oh no, that's all right," he smiled, then reached into his wallet. "Wait a second," he said as he handed her a white business card. "This is my business card. I'm afraid I ruined your dress," he pointed to her coffee-stained skirt. "My secretary will reimburse you." "I apologize once more." "Oh, sir, that's fine, you don't have to," Lena said. "Please, I insist," he persisted. Lena didn't know what was going on, but she knew she needed to get out of there immediately. "Thank you, sir, I really appreciate it," she said, hoping to cut off the conversation quickly and walk away to the back. "Have a nice day," she added as she hurried away. Once back at the back section of the plane, Lena let out a deep breath. She looked down at her hands and noticed that they were shaking. She felt like she had seen a ghost. A ghost with the face of her late husband on it. She had to talk to someone. This was the only way to make sure that she was not losing her mind. And she knew exactly who to talk to. "Cassandra?" she asked nervously. Cassandra turned her head, and the minute she saw the look on Lena's face, she knew something serious was going on. "Talk to me," she said, adopting a nurturing tone as she patted Lena's back. "Tell me I'm not crazy," Lena began, nervously locking eyes with Cassandra. Cassandra looked at her questioningly. "It's okay if it's all too much for you, Lena," she said calmly and softly. "We would all understand if you want to take a couple of extra weeks off, you know," she added. No, that's not it," Lena muttered, opening her locket. Then she took out a photograph, holding it in her hands for a moment before adding, "Doesn't he look like my late husband?" She pointed at the man in seat 37A and then opened her hands to reveal the photograph. Cassandra looked at her with great disbelief. You could tell she was thinking that Lena might be losing her mind. Her mouth fell open a little bit, and then she said, "Look, Lena, that's..." Cassandra had only begun to speak when she glanced at the wrinkled photo in Lena's hand. "Oh my gosh," she gasped, covering her mouth in shock. "That man looks just like your late husband. How is that poke-overing?" "That's what I'm thinking," Lena replied, quietly wondering who the man resembling her husband was. The relief washed over Lena as Cassandra's expression confirmed her recognition of the uncanny resemblance she too had noticed. It wasn't just her imagination, that man truly looked like her late husband. But the reality remained that he couldn't be her husband. She stared at the business card in her hands, the one he had given her. It bore the name, Nathan Jones, in bold letters, indicating that he was the chief executive officer of a staffing and recruitment company. It was a far cry from what her Gabriel had been doing. He had always been passionate about working with people and helping them, which led him to work at a shelter for ex-convicts, assisting them in reintegrating into society as smoothly as possible. This man, Nathan Jones, was clearly not her husband. Unless, Lena thought to herself with a chuckle, he had undergone a drastic transformation and faked his own death to start an entirely new life under a new identity. The idea seemed too far-fetched, but in the midst of her confusion, it brought a moment of humor. "I don't understand," Lena whispered, her voice trembling. "Did I imagine Gabriel's death somehow? Has he been out there this whole time while I mourned him?" Tears welled up in her eyes, threatening to spill over. Cassandra gently squeezed her shoulder, offering comfort. "You're overwhelmed, Lena, but there has to be a logical explanation. You need to talk to him. Maybe he knows something that can make sense of this."